Page 6 of The Adventures of Master F.J. by George Gascoigne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The moon was now at the full, the skies clear and the weather temperate, by reason whereof he might the more plainly and with the greater contentation behold his long desired joyes. And spreading his armes abroad to embrace his loving Mistresse, he sayd, O my deare Lady, when shall I be able with any desert to countervaile the least part of this your bountifull goodnesse? The Dame, whether it were of feare indeed, or that the wilinesse of womanhood had taught her to cover her conceites with some fine dissimulation, start back from the Knight, and shrieking, but softly, sayd unto him, Alas, servant, what have I deserved that you come against me with naked sword as against an open enemy? Ferdinando perceiving her intent excused himselfe, declaring that he brought the same for their defence, and not to offend her in any wise. The Lady being therewith somewhat appeased, they began with more comfortable gesture to expel the dread of the said late affright, and sithens to become bolder of behaviour, more familiar in speech, and most kind in accomplishing of common comfort. But why hold I so long discourse in describing the joyes which, for lack of like experience, I cannot set out to the full? Note, Q1 here inserts. Were it not that I know to whom I write, I would the more beware what I write. F.J. was a man, and neither of us are senseless, and therefore I should slander him, over and besides a great obloquy to the whole genealogy of Aeneas, if I should imagine that of tender heart he would forbear to expresse her more tender limbes against the hard floor. Sufficed that of her courteous nature she was content to accept boards for a bed of downe, mats for camerick sheetes, and the night-gowne of F.J. for a counterpoint to cover them, and thus with calme content, instead of quiet sleep, they beguiled the night, until the proudest starre began to abandon the firmament, when F.J. and his Mistresse were constrained also to abandon their delights, and with 10,000 sweet kisses and streight embracings, did frame themselves to play loth to depart. End of note. Well, remedy there was none, but Dame Elinor must return unto her chamber, and he must also convey, as closely as might be, into his chamber, the which was hard to do, the day being so far sprung, and he having a large base court to passe over before he could recover his staire-foot door. And though he were not much perceived, yet the Lady Fraunces being no lesse desirous to see an issue of these enterprises, than he was willing to cover them in secrecy, laid watch, and even at the entring of his chamber door, perceived the point of his naked sword glistening under the skirt of his night-gowne, whereat she smiled and said to her selfe, This geare goeth well about. Well, Ferdinando having now recovered his chamber, he went to bed. There let him sleep, as his Mistresse did on the other side. Although the Lady Fraunces being thoroughly tickled now in all the veines, could not enjoy such quiet rest, but arising tooke another gentlewoman of the house with her, and walked into the parke to take the fresh aire of the morning. They had not long walked there, but they returned, and though Ferdinando Jeronimi had not yet slept sufficiently, for one which had so far travailed in the night past, yet they went in to his chamber to raise him, and coming to his bedside found him fast asleep. Alas, quoth that other gentlewoman, it were pity to awake him. Even so it were, quod Dame Fraunces, but we will take away somewhat of his, whereby he may perceive that we were here, and looking about the chamber, his naked sword presented itself to the hands of Dame Fraunces, who took it with her, and softly shutting his chamber door again, went down the stairs, and recovered her own lodging in good order and unperceived of any body, saving only that other gentlewoman which accompanied with her. At the last Ferdinando awaked, and appareling himself, walked out also to take the air, and being thoroughly recomforted, as well with remembrance of his joyes forepast, as well with the pleasant harmony which the birds made on every side, and the fragrant smell of the redolent flowers and blossoms which budded on every branch, he did in these delights compile these verses following. Note, Q1 here inserts. The occasion, as I have heard him rehearse, was the encounter that he had with his lady by light of the moon, and forasmuch as the moon in midst of their delights did vanish away, or was overspread with a cloud, thereupon he took the subject of his theme, and thus it ensueth, called a moonshine banquet. End of note. Dame Cynthia her selfe that shines so bright, and deigneth not to leave her lofty place, but only then when Phoebus showes his face, which is her brother borne and lends her light, disdained not yet to do my lady right, to prove that in such heavenly wights as she, it fitteth best that right and reason be. For when she spied my lady's golden rayes, into the clouds her head she shrouds, and shamed to shine where she her beames displayes. Good reason yet, that to my simple skill, I should the name of Cynthia adore, by whose high help I might behold the more my lady's lovely lookes at mine own will, with deep content to gaze, and gaze my fill of courtesie, and not of dark disdaine. Dame Cynthia disclosed my lady plaine, she did but lend her light, as for a light, with friendly grace to show her face, that else would show and shine in her despight. Dan Phoebus, he with many a lowring look, had her beheld of yore in angry wise, and when he could none other meane devise, to staine her name, this deep deceit he tooke, to be the bait that best might hide his hooke. Into her eyes his parching beames he cast, to scorch their skins that gazed on her full fast, whereby when many a man was sunburnt so, they thought my Queene the sun had been with scalding flames which wrought them all that woe. So that when many a look had looked so long, as that their eyes were dim and dazzled both, some fainting hearts that were both lewd and loath to look again from whence that error sprung, gan close their eyes for fear of farther wrong, and some again once drawn into the maze, gan lewdly blame the beames of beauties blaze. But I with deep foresight did soon espie, how Phoebus meant by false intent to slander so her name with cruelty. Wherefore at better leisure thought I best, to try the treason of his treacherie, and to exalt my lady's dignity, when Phoebus fled and drew him down to rest, amid the waves that welter in the west. I gan behold this lovely lady's face, whereon Dame Nature spent her gifts of grace, and found therein no parching heat at all, but such bright hue as might renew an angel's joyes in reign celestial. The courteous moon that wished to do me good, did shine to show my Dame more perfectly, but when she saw her passing jollity, the moon for shame did blush as red as blood, and shrunk aside and kept her horns in hood. So that now when Dame Cynthia was gone, I might enjoy my lady's looks alone, yet honored still the moon with true intent, who taught us skill to work our will, and gave us place till all the night was spent. F.J. And now to return to my tale. By that time, that he returned out of the park, it was dinner time, and at dinner they all met, I mean both Dame Elinor, Dame Fraunces, and Ferdinando. I leave to describe that the Lady Fraunces was gorgeously attired, and set forth with very brave apparel, and Madame Elinor only in her night gowne girt to her, with a coiffe trimmed a la Piedmontese, on the which she ware a little cap crossed over the crowne with two bands of yellow sarsnet or cypress, in the midst whereof she had placed, of her own handwriting, in paper this worde, Contented. This attire pleased her then to use, and could not have displeased Mistresse Fraunces, had she not been more privy to the cause, than to the thing it selfe. At least the Lord of the Castle, of ignorance, and Dame Fraunces of great temperance, let it passe without offence. At dinner, because the one was pleased with all former reckonings, and the other party privy to the account, there passed no word of taunt or grudge, but omnia bene. After dinner Dame Elinor, being no lesse desirous to have Ferdinando's company, then Dame Fraunces was to take him in some pretty trip, they began to question how they might best passe the day. The Lady Elinor seemed desirous to keep her chamber, but Mistresse Fraunces for another purpose seemed desirous to ride abroad, thereby to take the open aire. They agreed to ride a mile or twain for solace, and requested Ferdinando to accompany them, the which willingly granted. Each one parted from other to prepare themselves, and now began the sport, for when he was booted, his horses saddled, and he ready to ride, he gan miss his rapier, whereat all astonied he began to blame his man, but blame whom he would, found it could not be. At last the ladies going towards the horseback called for him in the base court, and demanded if he were ready, to whom he answered, Madam, I am more than ready, and yet not so ready as I would be. And immediately taking himself in trip, he thought best to utter no more of his conceit, but in haste more than good speed mounted his horse, and coming towards the dames presented himself, turning, bounding, and taking up his courser to the uttermost of his power in bravery. After suffering his horse to breathe himself, he gan to allay his own choller, and to the dames he said, Fair ladies, I am ready when it pleaseth you to ride whereso you command. How ready soever you be, servant, quod Dame Elinor, it seemeth your horse is readier at your command than at ours. If he be at my command, mistress, quod he shall be at yours. Gramercy, good servant, quod she, but my meaning is, that I fear he be too stirring for our company. If he prove so, mistress, quod he, I have here a soberer palfrey to serve you on. The dames being mounted, they rode forthwards by the space of a mile or very near, and Ferdinando, whether it were of his horses courage or his own choller, came not so near them as they wished. At last the Lady Fraunces said unto him, Master Jeronimy, you said that you had a sober horse, which if it be so, we would be glad of your company, but I believe by your countenance your horse and you are agreed. Ferdinando alighting, called his servant, changed horses with him, and overtaking the dames, said to Mistresse Fraunces, And why do you think, fair lady, that my horse and I are agreed? Because by your countenance, quod she, it seemeth your patience is stirred. In good faith, quod he, you have guessed aright, but not with any of you. Then we care the lesse, servant, quod Dame Elinor. By my troth, mistress, quod he, looking well about him that none might hear but they two, it is with my servant, who hath lost my sword out of my chamber. Dame Elinor, little remembring the occasion, replied, It is no matter, servant, quod she, you shall hear of it again, I warrant you, and presently we ride in Gods peace, and I trust shall have no need of it. Yet, mistress, quod he, a weapon serveth both uses, as well to defend as to offend. Now by my troth, quod Dame Fraunces, I have now my dreame, for I dreamt this night that I was in a pleasant meadow alone, where I met with a tall gentleman, apparelled in a night gowne of silke, all embroidered about with a guard of naked swords, and when he came towards me, I seemed to be afraid of him, but he recomforted me, saying, Be not afraid, faire Lady, for I use this garment only for mine own defence, and in this sort went that warlike God Mars, what time he taught Dame Venus to make Vulcan a hammer of the new fashion. Notwithstanding these comfortable words, the fright of the dreame awaked me, and sithens unto this hour I have not slept at all. And what time of the night dreamt you this, quod Ferdinando? In the grey morning, about dawning of the day. But why aske you, quod Dame Fraunces? Ferdinando with a great sigh answered, Because that dreames are to be marked more at some hour of the night than at some other. Why are you so cunning at the interpretation of dreames, servant? Quod the Lady Elinor. Not very cunning, mistress, quod he, but guesse like a young scholar. The dames continued in these and like pleasant talkes, but Jeronimy could not be merry, as one that esteemed the preservation of his mistress' honour, no lesse than the obtaining of his own delights, and yet to avoid further suspicion, he repressed his passions as much as he could. The Lady Elinor, more carelesse than considerative of her own case, pricking forwards, said softly to him, I had thought you had received small cause, servant, to be thus dumpish, when I would be merry. Alas, dear mistress, quod he, it is altogether for your sake that I am pensive. Dame Fraunces of courtesie withdrew herself and gave them leave, when as Ferdinando declared unto his mistress, that his sword was taken out of his chamber, and that he dreaded much by the words of the Lady Fraunces, that she had some understanding of the matter. Dame Elinor now calling to remembrance what had passed the same night, at the first was abashed, but immediately, for these women be readily witted, cheered her servant, and willed him to commit unto her the salving of that sore. Thus they passed the rest of the way in pleasant talk with Dame Fraunces, and so returned towards the castle, where Jeronimy suffered the two dames to go together, and he alone unto his chamber to bewayle his own misgovernment. But Dame Elinor, whether it were according to old custome, or by wily policy, found meane that night that the sword was conveyed out of Mistress Fraunces' chamber, and brought unto hers, and after redelivery of it unto her servant, she warned him to be more wary from that time forthwards. Afterward, when he grew more bold and better acquainted with his mistress' disposition, he adventured one Friday in the morning to go unto her chamber, and thereupon wrote as followeth, which he termed a Friday's breakfast. That self same day, and of that day that hour, when she doth reign, that mocked Vulcan the smith, and thought it meete to harbour in her bower some gallant jest for her to dally with. That blessed hour, that blist and happy day, I thought it meete with hasty steps to go unto the lodge wherein my Lady lay, to laugh for joy, or else to weepe for woe. And lo, my Lady of her wonted grace, first lent her lips to me as for a kisse, and after that her body to embrace, wherein Dame Nature wrought nothing amisse. What followed next, guesse you that know the trade, for in this sort my Friday's feast I made. F.J. Many dayes passed these two lovers with great delight, their affaires being no lesse politically governed, than happily atchieved. And surely it should seeme in sad earnest, that he did not only love her, but was furthermore so ravished in ecstasies with continual remembrance of his delights, that he made an idol of her in his inward conceit. So seemed it by this challenge to beauty, which he wrote in his praise, and upon her name. Beauty, shut up thy shop, and truss up all thy trash, My Nell hath stoln thy finest stuff, and left thee in the lash. Thy market now is marr'd, thy gaines are gone God wot, Thou hast no ware that may compare with this that I have got. As for thy painted pail and wrinkles circlet up, Are deare enough for such as lust to drink of every cup. Thy body's bolster'd out with bombast and with bags, Thy rolls, thy ruffs, thy culls, thy coifs, thy jerkins, and thy jags, Thy curling and thy cost, thy frisling and thy fair, to court with all those toys, and there set forth such ware, Before their hungry eyes, that gaze on every jest, And choose the cheapest chaffer still to please their fancy best. But I, whose steadfast eyes could never cast a glance, With wandering look amid the press, to take my choice by chance, Have won by due desert, a piece that hath no peer, And left the rest as refuse all, to serve the market there. There let him choose that list, there catch the best who can, A painted blazing bait may serve, to choke a gazing man. But I have slipped thy flour, that freshest is a few, I have thy corn, go sell thy chaff, I list to seek no new. The windows of mine eyes are glazed with such delight, As each new face seems full of faults that blazeth in my sight. And not without just cause, I can compare her so. Lo here my glove, I challenge him that can or dare say no. Let Theseus come with club, or Paris brag with brand, To prove how fair their Hellen was, that scourged the Grecian land. Let mighty Mars himself come armed to the field, And vaunt Dame Venus to defend, with helmet, spear, and shield. This hand that had good hap, my Hellen to embrace, Shall have like luck to foil her foes, and daunt them with disgrace, And cause them to confesse, by verdict and by oath, How far her lovely looks do staine the beauties of them both, And that my Hellen is more fair than Paris' wife, And doth deserve more famous praise than Venus for her life. Which if I not performe, my life then let me leese, Or else be bound in chaines of change, to beg for beauties fees. F.J. By this challenge I guesse that either he was then in an ecstasie, or else sure I am now in a lunacie, for it is a proud challenge made to Beauty her selfe, and all her companions, and imagining that Beauty having a shop, where she uttered her wares of all sundry sorts, his Lady had stolen the finest away, leaving none behind her, but painting, bolstering, forcing, and such like, the which in his rage he judgeth good enough to serve the court, and thereupon grew a great quarrel. When these verses were by the negligence of his Mistresse dispersed into sundry hands, and so at last to the reading of a courtier, well Ferdinando had his desire, if his Mistresse liked them, but as Bartello writeth, she grew in jealousy, that the same were not written by her, because her name was Elinor and not Hellen. And about this point have been divers and sundry opinions among the Venetians. For this and divers other of his most notable poems have come to view of the world, and some have attributed this praise unto a Hellen, who deserved not so well as this Dame Elinor should seem to deserve, and yet never a barrel of good herring between them both, but that other Hellen, because she was, saith Bartello, of so base conditions, as may deserve no manner commendation in any honest judgment. Therefore he thinketh that he would never bestow verse of so mean a subject. And yet some of his acquaintance knowing also that he was sometimes acquainted with Hellen, have stood in argument that it was written by Helen and not by Elinor. Well, mine author affirmeth that it was written by this Dame Elinor, and that unto her he thus alledged that he tooke it all for one name, or at least he never read of any Elinor such matter as might sound worthy like commendation for beauty. And indeed, considering all circumstances of histories, and comparing also the time that such reports do spread of his acquaintance with Helen, it cannot be written lesse than 6 or 7 years before he knew Helen. Marry, peradventure, if there were any acquaintance between him and that Helen afterwards, he might adapt it to her name, and so make it serve both their turns, as elder lovers have done before, and still do, and will do world without end. Well, by whom he wrote it I know not, and to return to the purpose, he sought more certainly to please his Mistresse Elinor with this sonnet written in her praise as followeth. The stately dames of Rome their pearles did weare about their neckes to beautify their name, but she whom I do serve, her pearles doth beare close in her mouth, and smiling shew the same. No wonder then, though every word she speakes a jewell seeme in judgment of the wise, since that her sugared tongue the passage breakes between two rockes bedecked with pearles of price. Her haire of gold, her front of ivory, a bloody heart within so white a breast, her teeth of pearle, lips ruby, crystall eye. Needes must I honour her above the rest, since she is formed of none other mould, but ruby, crystall, ivory, pearle, and gold. Ferdinando Hieronimi. Of this sonnet, were it not a little too much praise, as the Italians do most commonly offend in the superlative, I could the more commend it, but I hope the party, to whom it was dedicated, had rather it were much more, than any thing lesse. End of page 6.